the objective of the Constitution, you then frame a Constitution to achieve that objective.
Because we really do have a race problem. Those divisions are real. We see it in our politics, we see it in our trade union. We see that they take the divisions with them. Look at where people live in this US. You have enclaves in the Bronx and in Richmond Hill and in Brooklyn. They're taking the division with them.
Women are dying in the streets, and we have a government pontificating running around campaigning for women's vote. No women should vote in this election coming up unless there is something done to the legislation as Magistrate Kim is advocating.
That voices like ours that are not in the political trench fighting it out, voices like ours should become stronger. One of the things about the Caribbean is that we have never had one discourse. Bass will know the days of the New World and the Old World and the radical left and so on. What we had was this concourse of ideas, which I think in the early days of independence pushed us in a certain direction. We've got to move back to that point of having these multiple discourses.
Good night, Guyana. Good night, Guyanese. Good night, friends and families and Globespan viewers. This is another edition of a political discussion that we bring to you every Wednesday evening at this time. Today, of course, we're discussing: is there space for new or third political parties in Guyana in the upcoming election? My name again is Salim Nasruddin, and I'll be your moderator for tonight. This is a live program. Please share to your friends and families as we may be discussing some very important and critical issues that will help you to understand the issues in Guyana as you prepare to vote and you prepare to listen to all the parties. I'm reminding you again, the views and comments expressed on this show does not represent that of the management of Globespan. It certainly does not represent mine, its principals, or anyone else associated with Globespan 24x7. It is wholly and solely that of the panelists. Tonight, our guests are Mr. Ralph Ramkaran. He should have been here. We are waiting on him to be on. And our other guest is Mr. Lennox Schumann, leader of the Liberty and Justice Party. Well, good night, Lennox, and how are you doing today?
Good night, Salim. I'm doing well.
Great. Well, and by the way, before we get started, there is a poll, and this might give you a good indication of where you are, Mr. Schumann. The poll is there a new party an option for you in 2020? So if you're listening and you're seeing the poll popping up, please vote whether you believe a new party is an option for you in 2020. We've had a slew of political parties, third parties over the last 53 years, and they've been called everything from farce to hyena to mercenary, prostitute, opportunists. Third parties. Whether they were TUF that coalesced with Burnham and the early PNC. We had DLM who fought for free and fair election in Guyana. We had the Guyana United Muslim Party, that was looking for a very niche sort of vote. We had ROAR, Rise, Organize and Rebuild Guyana, that worked all over Guyana in promoting the need for a reformed constitution to reflect the makeup of Guyana. You had the URP, you had WPA, the AFC, and so many others that came. Some are still here. But they played a role, good, bad, or ugly. They did play a role in Guyana's political history and current landscape. So with that, I want to start off today with some of the hot news, of course. I think we have Mr. Ralph Ramkaran. Welcome, Mr. Ramkaran. How are you doing?
Good
evening.
You, very well, thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Sorry, Mr. Ramkaran, can you kindly click the camera button on your screen?
Thank you.
Yeah. So with that, I wanted to bring Mr. Schumann in early on this.
Good
Today's
evening, Ralph.
headline.
How are you?
Good.
We plan these shows just trying to read the temperature in Guyana on the political things, and then suddenly with this show we planned it well, and suddenly we were slammed with this headline that says Schumann in talks with Apple, and it's kind of the basis of third party politics in Guyana. I know you've been on record fiercely criticizing the PPP as well as the PNC, as well as APNU, and in their record. You're meeting with them. How is that going?
Well, Salim, thank you. And for the viewers, Ralph, good evening again once. It's interesting how the news cycle works. When we met with ANOG the first time, I didn't see any sensational headline that says, the Liberty and Justice Party is meeting with ANOG. When we met with the confab at New Thriving Restaurant some 2 weeks ago, we didn't see any sensational headline that said, Liberty and Justice Party met with ANOG, met with FedUp, met with the yet to be formed the Citizen Initiative, nor TNM. I did not see those sensational headlines in that sense. And now,
is your meeting?
There's now a meeting. There's now a meeting with the president, and all of a sudden it's like, whoa, the world exploded. What happened to all of those other meetings? Why does it become such a sensational issue at this juncture?
Well, you tell me, why is it sensational? I mean, you're meeting with a party that is, according to many, unconstitutional. Illegal and so on, and why would you want to meet with them to even talk politics, given they're very they're basically on thin ice?
Well, when we established the Liberty and Justice Party, we sent out a letter to all political parties, to the leaders, and I think Ralphin himself was in receipt of one of those. And we have not received a formal response from any of them. However, we did meet with ANOG, we did meet with FedUp, informally in that sense. We did meet with the government, or the president in this sense, and the only party we have not met with is the PPP.
And are you planning to meet with the PPP? By the way, has the PPP responded to you? Have you officially written to them?
As I said, we wrote to all political parties, at least operative at the time, right? Mm-hmm. And they have not furnished a response, nor have they even called to say, look, we would like to meet with you. Well, of course, I must commend Ralph and FedUp and obviously the government for taking that initiative, because when we started off again, part of our constitution talks about being consummate diplomats, and to be able to work problems out, it cannot be a position that we wait until it starts into an acrimonious relationship and then try to form dialogue. Yeah. You have to start with an open gate right off the bat, so that you open that channel for dialogue to prevail.
Mr. David Granger, in an interview today, mentioned that in your meeting with him, that there are areas of convergence. Can you explain what he meant by that, and what are some of those areas of convergence?
Well, when I met with him, we talked about constitutional reform and why it has not happened, and the need for it. We talked about the promotion of good and inclusive governance and potential solutions on how we could approach that. We talked about the underdevelopment and marginalization of obviously indigenous communities and some coastal communities, and how we could address that about revamping the agricultural sector. It's not rocket science in what needs to be done. It is just a matter of how we get it done.
Yeah. Were you able to discuss compliance with the Constitution with David Granger, Mr. David Granger?
No, I think that is a discussion that we would have to sit down and wait for Jack Dio and Mr. Granger to sit down and have that discussion three-way or four-way if Ralph is going to be in the room. To see how we get constitutional compliance from every political party, because violation of the Constitution is not.
But in all fairness, not all the parties are violating the Constitution. It's the APNU who's violating, isn't it?
No, violation of the Constitution is nothing new, Salim. When you look at it, the PPP did not have local government elections for how many years? And when you look at it, they also had members of parliament who sat in breach of the constitution for how many decades? Once again, violation of the constitution is nothing new. It is just it is just that people want to make it into a sensational issue. I mean, granted, we may never have been at this point where you would have seen a no confidence motion, but the constitution has been violated from the day it was signed into law.
Yeah. Well, let me get Mr. Ramkaran into this discussion. You, like Mr. Schuman, and you are a presidential candidate. He's a leader, and you're trying to build a party to compete in the 2020 elections. How does this news hit your radar? Is it something that is reminiscent of another AFC episode where here you have a powerful party that has potentials and now talking with one of the big guys, and that will totally decimate the whole idea or the whole premise or the trust of third parties? How did it hit your radar?
Well, I think that in the first place, that the more the parties which are formed and the more the variety of views that are offered to the electorate, the better for the electorate, the wider the choice. So there are several third part or smaller parties now, the Liberal and Justice, New and United Guyana. I understand there are at least one, probably two new parties that are going to be established soon. There's also, of course, the party based in Berbice, the Federal United Party, called Fed Up. And each of us is offering something different, a different focus to the Guyanese people. And that's all for the good.
No, but my specific question was when you heard the news today of Mr. Schuman, which is a third party, a new party. Yeah.
I'm coming to that. And each party has to decide its own course of action and its own course of conduct. We chose to reach out, as Mr. Schuman has reached out, to the smaller parties and to engage with those parties. Mr. Schuman and his Liberal and Justice Party, Liberty Justice Party, feels that their course of action is to reach out to the larger parties who we are all criticizing at the moment. That's up to Liberty and Justice Party. I wish them luck. I wish them in whatever their objective is to be successful. That is what we want. We want constitutional reform. We want a new system of government. We want an end to political division and instability. We want to end ethnic dominance in politics. And I'm sure Liberty and Justice feel the same way about many of these things. And therefore, I wish them luck. I will not succeed.
And I assume the objective that you've just laid out are objectives that smaller parties in particular might have an interest in. So my question is, and I come back to the question, is in the break of the news that the Liberty and Justice Party met with APNU, does that instill a level of fear or distrust by voters who might be interested in third parties to say, hey, these guys are nothing more than another AFC coming around the block. They're gonna get my vote and they're gonna do something with it.
I have met Mr. Schuman, and we have met Mr. Schuman several times, and we have confidence that that he understands fully the role of the PNC, the PNCR, and APNU, as well as the PPP in Guyana's politics. These parties have been thrown up by virtue of the ethnic division in Guyana, and they are interested, they are driven by ethnic dominance. And there is nothing that can change that. That started since 1953 and 55.
Correct.
55 and starting at the 57 elections. This is 50 years. And this is not going to change. Talking is not going to change. We need a new political system, and the only way in which that can be obtained.
And this shows to examine how third parties or smaller parties like yours can effectuate such ultimate change and objective. I want to get Mr. Schumann back into the conversation here. Do you believe that, and knowing the mistrust for new and third parties when it comes to Guyana's history, do you feel that it might have been a misstep for you to, in the midst of what's happening in Guyana and in a very polarized, high-stake election, for you to kind of jettison much of your ideals and risk meeting with APNU and risking all of that goodwill that you might have had?
I don't support your statement in that we might have jeopardized anything. Once again, when we met with Ralph and Anog, and when we met with FedUp and the Confab, our ideals were perfectly and still are perfectly intact. Anything, and here's the thing, within each party there are reasonable people.
But I agree that your ideals might be pure, you might be pure at heart, but you don't have 50,000 votes in you. Votes come from people, and people have perceptions. So I'm asking, from a voter's perspective, have you spent your potentials?
Well, I don't agree with that statement. Once again, that we would have spent our potential. I think what we have done is enhance the governance of the country in meeting with all of these parties. When we met with Ralph, there was a meeting that we hoped would pretty much lay out what we want to see Guyana, and there were a lot of commonalities in what we wanted to get done. When we met with the other parties at the New Thriving restaurant, it was along the very same lines. And when we met with this administration, it's the very same lines. Whenever we do meet with the PPP, it will be the very same lines. These are the things that we're driving. Now, I want to go back to the statement that I was going to make, is within each camp, there are reasonable people. Believe it or not, there are reasonable people within each camp. And, it's unfortunate that sometimes the extreme voices kind of pull everything apart. But the more voices you have that are saying the same thing in all of these camps, I think it is more inclined to get change compared to if you only have one camp saying something and the next camp not being receptive. When it comes time to bring about that change in Parliament, it becomes very, very difficult. And if you look at what happened, I can't remember the year in Trinidad, when there was a leader who came up and he said all the right things, and by polls, he was actually going to take a majority of the votes. And the then government and the then opposition literally went behind his back, and they came to an agreement and say, look, you know what? This is going to be bad for us. Why don't I go into your communities and do this, and you're going to accept this? And when he contested at elections, the guy got 0 seats. And that is part of history. Now, we have to ensure that that does not happen. I mean, I wish ANOG the very best. I wish FedUp the very best, and whatever other political party comes along, I wish them the very, very best. Yeah. At the end of the day, all of us are paddling in the same direction. The way we go about getting change now, I think that is where you need those reasonable voices in every single corner.
Yeah. And again, there's fundamentally nothing wrong in speaking with APNU, the PPP, or any other party. In your discussion, let's say with APNU or even the PPP, is joining those party using the support base that you may have. Is that on the tables? Are you looking to join forces with them in the upcoming election? Is that one of your discussion agenda item?
What we're talking about are strategic cooperation, right? When we talk about constitutional reform, for example, we don't like, one thing with us when we started off is that we don't like open-ended questions. When we talk about constitutional reform, we don't want to sit there and say, well, constitutional reform is on our agenda and we're going to get it done such and such time. When we talk about legalization of cannabis, We don't want to hear that it's on our agenda. We want to hear constitutional reform is on our agenda, and by the end of 2020, we would like tabled in Parliament a first draft of
Well,
what we propose.
constitutional
Hold on.
reform was
When
on
you
the
talk-
agenda.
when you
Constitutional
talk about-
reform was
hold
on the
on.
agenda in 2015 with
Salam, but-
APNU. So I assume that
Salam,
question
but
has already
this
been
is what I'm
answered.
getting at, right? We cannot work with open-ended questions. We want to ensure that when the end of 2020 comes, that there's a framework that is tabled and ready for passage in Parliament. When we talk about the legalization of cannabis, we don't want to hear, oh yeah, well, it's on our agenda. We want to hear a date as to when we could have the structures in place to accept these things, to bring it on the table.
Correct.
Those are the things that we want to
if
get
I'm not
done.
mistaken, constitutional reform had a timeline and was in the manifesto of the APNU in 2015. I'm quite sure it's going to be in the 2020 manifesto also. If that's on the table for APNU, is that something that's worth your parties joining them?
Salim, who sits at the top of the committee? Who is chair of the committee on constitutional reform?
I think it's the Prime Minister.
It is. I think, and Ralph, maybe you could correct me if I'm wrong here. I think it's Dr. Jagdeo who is the chair of the committee. The Prime Minister has the framework. It's sitting on his desk collecting dust. But at the end of the day, the leader of the opposition has said constitutional reform is not in the PPP's best interest, and they're going to have to go through a referendum on constitutional reform. You don't need a referendum. The election in itself is a referendum on constitutional reform.
Yes, and Ralph, let me hear your side of the story. If the PPP or the PNC were to agree on some of the objectives that ANUG is interested in, is that something you're looking to join them with as a smaller party?
PPP and the PNC will not agree to our objectives. And that is why ANUG has come into existence. I left the PPP in the middle of 2012. And I did nothing political. I was engaged in no political activity for 6 years until now, when some friends came together and we decided that the country needs a party, a political movement with a vision. And that vision is to end ethnic dominance in politics. And the way to end ethnic dominance in politics is to create an executive which has equal representatives from two main political parties. An electoral system that is constituency-based with a mechanism for proportionality. And a parliament that represents the people of Guyana in proportion to their votes. Those are the three basic elements.
And I think you will find no one who would disagree with you on that
Yes.
around Guyana. And I'm sure there's probably 100,000. So, and this discussion tonight is about third parties and their ability to effectuate change. And if you have an idea like that, for sure, it's perfect and it's good and it ought to be adhered to. But my thing is, how the smaller parties win the trust of voters and win enough seats to win the next election.
Well, the first thing is...
And that's the mechanics I believe I want us to discuss here. I understand third parties since 1953 until now, third parties have always articulated the most relevant issue for the country. However, they have never been voted into government. So how do we get ANUG? How do we get JLP and other new parties?
LJP, Salim.
So Ralph is on the mic. So if he could tell me what's his strategy on getting voters to turn out and vote for him.
Let me answer you. The smaller parties that have achieved some level of political support in Guyana have been two. The United Force in the 60s and the AFC recently. Both of these parties have been absorbed by the ruling party, which happened on both occasions to be the PNC. They have been absorbed absorbed, and their agenda completely quashed and destroyed. So if a third party seeks to join or coalesce or collaborate with any of these two major political forces, which have had this country in their grip since 1957, without doing what is necessary, which is the vision we have projected, then this will continue. So our objective is to remain completely independent, to learn from what has been happened in the past, the absorption of third parties by the two big giants, to learn that lesson and to understand that we have to remain completely independent and secure enough votes from the electorate. If we don't win the elections, which we hope to do, support enough, obtain enough votes from the electorate to ensure that no single party obtains an absolute majority. And with that power and influence, we would therefore be able to influence the process of establishing a new governance system for Guyana. I know many people in the People's National Congress, in the government, and I've known many of them for very many years. And they're all reasonable people. And so are many people in the PPP. But reasonableness is not going to change the system of ethnic political dominance in Guyana.
Right.
Right? Look, the APNU proposed, as you just said, constitutional reform in 2015. Why didn't they implement it? They implemented it because they know that if they do, they're likely to be in second place. Whereas now they hold the dominant position. The PPP hasn't implemented it since the 70s. Well, they came into office in the 90s. They haven't implemented it because they don't want to share power. So unless you are in a position to force them to move forward on a new system of government, they're not going to move. And discussions with them is not going to work.
Yes, and you did mention that of recent the AFC was the other smaller party that became big, that was that coalesced with the PNC, and in your case, what you used the word absorbed into the PNC. Mr. Schuman, with such a high stake in 2015. And with so much hope in the AFC as a possible winner of an election, maybe in 2020, isn't there a major mistrust for smaller parties that yes, they will do either what UF did or they will do whatever AFC did, and even if you're a WPA supporters, I got to throw this in. If you're a WPA supporter and you were a Rodneyite and you believe in the ideals of Rodney, you got to be betrayed at some level. So there's mistrust constantly brewing around third parties. Schuman, how do we get out of this mistrust so that some of the ideas that you and Anouk stand for can be realized?
At the end of the day, the political environment obviously fosters a lot of mistrust. But I want to go back to something about the AFC in that sense. The AFC never really had a base. The AFC simply pulled from the PPP and the PNC, and that is how they ended up where they were. People who were disgruntled. I mean, if you look at Kamraj Ramjatan, Moses Nagamoot, Raphael Trotman, majority of them, have left parties to form something that they thought could have worked, and to a great extent it did. But when you look at the base in itself, is that they never had a base. Now, while we are talking about constitutional reform or talking about revamping the mode of governance and all these things, there is one thing that seems to escape what I'd say the modern mind or the Georgetown-centric thinking, is that indigenous peoples had suffered since Christopher Columbus, since we rescued him. And while slavery has ended, indentured servitude has ended, indigenous peoples, the suffering has never ended. So it is nice to have all of this political things, but at the end of the day, that has to be also married with making a difference to the people on the ground. We could try with all of the governance structure to try the political hegemony and all these things. But until we start solving the bread and butter issues for some of these marginalized people, or peoples in that sense, yes, let's talk constitutional reform, but let's also marry that with the bread and butter issues on the ground. Those are some of the things that we have to start looking at. And when we're talking about base and mistrust, is that we have already established our base. So for us, if anyone wants to remove us from any kind of administration in that sense, and I don't want to sound like I'm going to hold people hostage, but we already have that base. Peter de Geer never had a base per se in at least when he formed Tough. There was a Portuguese man walking into indigenous communities giving handouts, and thus the handout mentality was birthed in indigenous communities. If you look at what the PPP has, predominantly an Indo base, and the PNC has predominantly an Afro base. So at some point, you have to have a base upon which you're going to build. And unfortunate or fortunate as you may like to look at it, is that we have already established our base.
And again, the public's mistrust for smaller parties is not something I'm dreaming up or creating. It's all over the web and Facebook, all the discussion, all the TV shows, and so on. So I think it's not something to be dismissed as smaller parties where your margins are going to be even thinner going into elections. So I want to get back to the core of the discussion. What fundamentally do both of you believe is the purpose of smaller parties, knowing fully well, and we've got to be real here, that neither of you have a chance of winning the next election, 5 seat, 4 seat, 5 cents, whatever seats what number you might pick. Yes, maybe we can discuss that, but again, what's the purpose if you're not going to win an election? What is the purpose doing campaign, and what's your purpose during a government's tenure?
We didn't set out to form a small party. We set out to establish a new vision for the Guyanese people, a new vision of governance, a new executive system that will eliminate ethnic insecurity and the striving for ethnic dominance in politics, which has been the main problem in Guyana since the 50s and have not been solved. So this vision, this vision is not propagated by any political party. And those who propagate something similar or something akin to a shared governance system have not fulfilled the promises they have made to the Guyanese people. And we believe that that promise can only be fulfilled and can only be solved if there is a political party that garners, or group of political parties that garner enough support to ensure that neither of them obtain an absolute majority. We can therefore put our agenda on the table and say that this is what we are asking in return for supporting you.
So you're saying the smaller party's role is basically to get enough seats to be a broker, a power broker?
We would like to win the elections, but
of course, yes.
But of course, if not, then sure.
So one of the purpose is a power broker.
We would be happy with that. The purpose, our purpose, is to implement our vision of a new governance system.
But I want to take your argument a little bit further. So you're saying it's a power broker. If you don't win, you become a power broker as a smaller party with 3, 4, 5 seats. Now, if you're a power broker either with the Indians or the Africans in the PNC or the PPP. How does that fit in with your agenda of bringing about a society where Indians and Africans are working together for the benefit of a better Guyana?
I would hope that whichever is the opposition party, that we will be able to collaborate with that opposition party.
But that opposition party will either be Indian or African.
Whichever one, Indian or African.
But again, it's ethnic then, it's ethnic based.
Well,
so it means that you'll be joining an Indian or an African
we will not be joining anybody.
I don't mean join, I mean vote with or
We will seek
broker
out,
with.
after the election, let us assume that the scenario you have for us plays out. One party gets the plurality, the other one gets a minority.
One
and
is Indian and one is African.
one is Indian, one is African.
Yeah.
The third party or a group of third parties get the, are capable, get enough votes to ensure that the government stays in power. We then have to talk to the opposition, and both the PPP and the PNC, Indian and African, have at one time or the other supported shared governance or inclusive governance in whatever language you wish to see. So we don't see that as a problem. But we will have our own independent view and position and vote. And I tell you, it is extremely difficult. I'm looking at the questions coming up. It is, and you have mentioned it several times. How can people trust a third party after the recent experience of the AFC?
Absolutely. Yeah.
People have forgotten. People have forgotten the United Force. That was since the 1960s. But the AFC's posture is live. And today, we have seen that they have abandoned all of their independence. They're now struggling and fighting among themselves as to see who will be the prime minister candidate. The first thing they did when they went in is to double their salaries. Now, to fight against that is extremely difficult, but we have to patiently explain to the people of Guyana that what we are interested in, we might be finished. We are working for a system that brings the two parties together. When they come together, there is no role for us. We might be the opposition. So we are not fighting. There is no quest for power in our parties. We want the power to bring the two main parties together. That's
and again, I think all smaller parties have been saying that over the years. Mr. Schuman, Mr. Ralph mentioned that power brokering is one of the purpose of smaller parties. What are some other purpose you believe smaller parties can be of benefit to the Guyana voters and the Guyana Guyanese political governance?
Salam, once again, I agree with Ralph on many of his points. However, I have to disagree with him that bringing the parties together is a possibility. We would live maybe 100, maybe 1,000 lifetimes, and you may not ever see those parties coming together. The way, and while I commend ANOG's objectives and their goals, we all have to work in a consolidated effort, regardless of which camp we're in, or whoever we talk to ensure that we achieve the same thing. Imagine if one party is saying something, and it just keeps hitting a brick wall. There's no receptor there. Then what happens? You could try to force all you want, but at some point, when that voice echoes back at you, it may push you off the block.
So what can smaller parties do then?
In some of these things, right? Once again, we have to take a consolidated effort with the reasonable people all around to ensure that we attain the change that is needed for the country. When we, sorry, Salim, I've just got my daughter here.
That's fine. That's fine. Yeah. So again, I understand that the smaller parties and the bigger parties may never come together. So what could smaller parties do to ensure that while they're not coming together, that governance is good for the people?
But once again, right? How does a cold virus change your system, Salim? How does a cold virus change anyone's system? It does so by force getting into your system, and then it forces change. You could take snot and rub it on your arm, rub it on your forehead, rub it on your skin, and it's not going to infect you. It's not going to force change in your body, so then you don't know how to react. What liberty and justice, and this is one of the reasons why we got into politics. We had tried advocacy, and advocacy obviously did not work. We had tried from the National Two-Shows Council to do a lot of things that did not work. And this is where we came up. The NTC still exists. The advocacy groups still exist. Now what we found is a third dimension to what I'd say infiltrate the system. Now, if all three of these systems work with a consolidated effort, I strongly believe that we are going to force change. But once again, you need people who are receptive on both sides to be able to bring about that change. It cannot just happen that we are going to be a political party and drive in that sense. Who knows, maybe at the end of the day, we may be the government of the Liberty and Justice Party, and Ralph would have to sit there and talk to us. And if that is the case, would it not make sense to have a receptive ear on this end compared to developing an acrimonious relationship in that end?
Yeah.
Right? And this is one of the reasons why we believe that starting off from a platform of dialogue is absolutely important.
And in the upcoming election, it's going to be, I would assume, a lot more polarized. There's a lot more at stake. The PPP and the PNC, of course, are gearing up very heavy, going back to their core supporters and ensuring that the votes are locked. With a very polarized election, how does smaller parties survive? Where do you find your votes?
Well, we will find our votes among those people who believe that it is time for a change after 50 plus years. It's time for a change in the governance system, and there are many such people. A lot of people who supported the AFC believe that, and the AFC votes dropped from 10% at the 2011 elections to 4% in the last year local government elections. So there are those people who are challenged, who are looking for a way out of this ethnic instability and ethnic dominance.
But aren't those same people burnt by the AFC's betrayal? Why would they go back to ANOG or Liberty or anyone else?
That is why ANOG exists. All of us were burned. Timothy Jonas, who is the chairman of ANOG, was a foundation member of the AFC. A lot of people have been burned, and that is why we exist, in order to do what the AFC should have been doing. That is to bring the two forces together. Look, these forces are not going to disappear. They're not going to go anywhere. And we are not offering a system that is voluntary. We want to change the constitution to make it obligatory on political parties to join with each other in the government. Now, which political party, which of the two main political parties, having had the opportunity of coming into the executive in equality, no matter what votes they get, will decide not to?
Yeah. Mr. Schuman, same question to you. In a very polarized 2020 election where the ethnic groups are going to go back to their camp in huge numbers and in large numbers coming out, where do you find your crack on voters? I assume you are looking at a more of a Amerindian sort of base.
Well, here's the thing. I don't belong to any of the two dominant ethnic groups. So obviously I don't have a camp to go back to. But you see, the reality is what we've found, and while a lot of people don't believe in polls...
So are you saying clearly that your votes may not be affected in a very polarized election because Amerindians are out of the AFC and the PPP and the PNC camps? So you've got you're building your own camp, so to speak.
Yes, to a certain extent. I would not say that's 100% accurate, but to a certain extent. Here's the thing. If you walk into a room and you see three people seated in that room, right? You've got an Indian, an African, and an Amerindian. I bet that people would almost automatically identify where they're going to vote, except for the Amerindian in the room. They're going to sit there and say, well, hold on a sec, one of these does not belong in this room, and who is it? Right? Rightly so, we don't have a camp to go back to. So the people that are going to vote for us, whether you want to say that it is many people who identify with us, I strongly believe that there is a significant amount of the population who understand what it is that the Liberty and Justice Party is all about, what the changes that we're driving towards are. And I strongly, strongly believe that those people will continue to drive for those very changes. And I think that we are still going to secure their support, regardless of where we sit.
Yeah. Just reminding our viewers that this is a live program. Please do ask your questions. We are looking at your questions.
Hello.
And we will integrate it. And right about now, we have a special guest, Dr. Bishnu Raghunath. I think he's the Dean of Political Science at the University of West Indies. Bishnu, welcome. Good evening.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening.
Yes, Bishnu is on telephone, so he'll be here on a short, for a short period. We were just, there's some noise behind you, Bishnu, if you can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hello?
It seems like you're at a nice wedding house or something. Sounds good.
No, I'm at a Diwali program at my son's school. So,
oh, awesome.
But
awesome.
I'm okay now.
Well, happy Diwali to you and your family. I think it's in a week's time, right?
Yes.
Okay. So we were just discussing in Guyana. It's gonna be a very polarized election in 2020, and you have smaller parties that are trying to build their base and argue a case to win the next election or to get as much seats as possible. What specific advice, based on your experience and your studies, would you want to advise small parties in Guyana on how to manage their campaign so they can get as much as they can, even with a very polarized election?
Well, the thing about it is that we clearly have a polarized society, both in Guyana and in Trinidad. What we need from the smaller parties is that the smaller parties must at least show their hands and they are willing to offer themselves in an election. The case of Guyana is somewhat different to Trinidad in that Guyana has a proportional representation model. And with that model, that would allow for small parties, even though they may not get, they may not be able to win the election, in that they would not be able to get the majority of votes, they would at least be able to get some seats within the parliament. And it is in that context, those seats that they can get would then make a big difference into how they would at least ensure that they are able to participate in the process, in the government, in the governance of the country. They will not be in government, but at least they will be able to participate in governance. And I think that is the most important thing that they could do. It is in that context that it is highly recommended that they at least offer themselves, run a decent campaign, and thereupon allow the citizenry the opportunity to support them with the campaign.
Yeah, and guys, Mr. Schumann and Mr. Ralph, please feel free to chime in at any time. We'll have Mr. Bishnu for another few minutes. Bishnu, I wanted to ask you also, and this was a big part of the discussion in Guyana on chat sites around the world. The AFC has been one of the largest small parties recently that coalesced with the APNU and has sort of lost its independence, and as such, much of its ideals have been abandoned. So it resulted in a huge mistrust of smaller parties, which has a role to play, of course, but is a huge mistrust. How does ANUG and, of course, Liberty Party and the other smaller parties that we have in Guyana, how do they rebuild trust that they might not have been, they did not cause upon themselves?
No, well, and this is a challenge for all small parties. All small parties will, in an attempt to at least get a bigger voice, they see themselves as having to have some sort of coalition with one of the more dominant parties. And to that extent, there's that concern as to whether or not they could get usurped or assimilated within that bigger party. And more importantly, the citizenry and the population at large may believe that they were simply playing independent part early on, but then they would be part and parcel of this bigger party. That is a concern for all small parties, and it is something that we're going to have to deal with. Parties are going to have to deal with. What they're going to have to do is they're going to have to at least keep on maintaining their positions on certain issues to at least indicate that they, while they may have a coalition with a bigger party, at least they would be able to at least indicate that they still have some degree of independence in thought, in policy, in ideology, in philosophy that will take them into the future. And I think that is what the smaller parties will have to do, maintain that they are campaigning on their own manifestos, their own policy programs, and that is what they have to hold true to that and let the population know that, yes, it is necessary for some sort of accommodation or coalition, but beyond that, we still maintain our independence, we still maintain our philosophy, and we go forward in the hope that we could win the people's trust.
And of course, in the Guyana context, that's easier said than done.
Definitely, not only in Guyana, also in Trinidad.
Mr. Schumann and Mr. Ramkran, do you guys have any questions or comments as it relates to Mr. Bishnu's statements?
Salim, I think one of the things that people have to realize is that any discussion around coalescing, right, whether it is ANOG and LJP, FedUp, APNU, PPP, anything of that sort, the question would always surround the trust issue. And I think to a great extent, for anyone to not learn from the AFC's mistakes, it would make us very, very poor students, not only as political parties, but I think as a country. And I say this, there are many, many people who would have gotten married and gotten divorced. And why did that happen? It happened because people would have realized that sometimes you make mistakes and you simply have to move on. That does not mean that they're bad people to begin with. It just means that there is no congruency in what they wanted to attain. But once again, that union still, or the potential of a union still exists. It does not mean that they would have sacrificed anything, their autonomy in that sense. And in terms of any coalition, once again, if it is us and any party, inclusive of ANOG, FedUp, the Citizen Initiative, APNU, or PPP, any of those, not just because you sit at a table and caucus with people means that you have given yourself 100% in that sense. There is a certain degree of you that still has to be autonomous. You still have to maintain your identity in that sense. Thus, we are going to all charge towards the same goal, yes. I do have my principles upon which I am not going to compromise quite a lot of things. And people have to recognize that when you enter into a relationship with a girl or whoever your partner is, you make that same commitment that there are certain principles you're not going to that you're not going to compromise, and it is the same way that you have to approach political union in that sense.
Correct. Mr. Ramkaran, do you have any comments on that?
I appreciate the advice of Dr. Raghunath in terms of maintaining parties and maintaining their independence. What has happened here in Guyana is we haven't had that experience. And I think the same thing has happened in Trinidad. There was a vibrant third party formed. I don't remember the name, I don't remember the leaders, but they joined the Panday government, and they did quite well. They got quite a few seats. They joined the Panday government. Basically no longer in existence. They're miniaturized. And all over the world, the same thing is happening. Were it not for the Brexit issue in the United Kingdom, the Liberal Democratic Party in the UK would have been completely destroyed because of their coalition with the conservative. And you have that all over the world. Once small parties, they're the Liberal Party in Germany, for 20 years or more, it was either the Christian Democrats or the Social Democrats getting into office with a minority, plurality. And the Liberals joined whichever party got the plurality. One time the Christian Democrats, one time not the Liberals, they were called the Democrats. They joined the Social Democrats or the Christian Democrats, depending on who got the plurality. The Free Democrats have now been totally destroyed. So third parties do not survive as a general rule when they join coalitions with larger parties. So that we have learned that lesson. We have learned that lesson by bitter experience in Guyana. And therefore it is we are adamant that we are not going to join with either of the two political parties to assist them to form a government or for us to get ministerial seats. Our objective is to bring these two parties together, and if necessary, we then go in the opposition or join the government if we get a sufficient threshold of support.
Correct.
Ralph, but here's a question for you, right? I mean, using the same argument, are we to ascertain or deduce from that statement that ANOG has no long-term objectives in politics, that your idea is to force change, and once that change is completed, then there's no need for a third party? I think if I'm to interpret what you're saying, that is what it is. That's the essence, right?
We hope that we will propose that every party that obtains a threshold of support in the National Assembly, we haven't determined that threshold yet, 20, 25, 30%, will be entitled to join the government. So that you will have the two big parties and any third party that has a threshold of support. If we don't get that threshold, maybe we will, but if we don't get that threshold, we then remain in the opposition. So we have a permanent role. The role of an opposition is a permanent role. What we are not interested in is joining the two political parties, one of the two, to keep that party in office or to get a ministerial position for ourselves.
Right. Bishnu, you're still there.
Yes, I'm still
I don't want to keep you too long. Do you have any closing statements?
Well, basically, I've listened to your colleague there, and basically I was concerned as to whether or not when he talked about the amount of votes that, or the percentage of votes, my concern was whether or not we were talking about whether we move into what in political terms to what constitutional democracy, or to try to get some government of national unity, where we could pull together not only members from the government, but from other parties, to at least work together for the development of the society. And it is something that I think one of my colleagues, Ralph Prendas, would have spoken about too in Guyana, the need for national unity, a government of national unity. It was something that was proposed at one point in time in Trinidad, but clearly it needs a political will from all the various parties to say this is what we need to have happen. And for all intents and purposes, that is where the small parties would also have a greater say, because at least they get the opportunity to at least have their say within the context of such a bigger government. But again, that is something for the future.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, with that, Vishnu, I want to say thank you for calling in. We really appreciate your time, and we want to wish you and your family a happy Diwali, and look forward to having you on this show again sometime to discuss Guyanese politics.
Certainly, it would be my pleasure.
Great, thank you very much. Right, guys. So this is that was Mr. Vishnu. We really appreciate him being on. I wanted to move to another question. again, voters, and I'm coming back to voters here because this is never about politicians and parties. It's always about the voters, what they get out of the whole argument that you guys are bringing forward. How do you distinguish yourself from the PPP and the PNC? I know you're going to say we're not an ethnic party, but in terms of real issues, the bread and butter issues that people are really looking to vote for, how do you distinguish yourself from the PPP and the PNC? If you're saying the same thing as they are saying, maybe we don't need smaller parties. So I would love for you guys to tell me, how do you compare yourself with the PPP, and how do you and the PNC, and how are you different?
Well, if you want me to go first, I can say,
go right ahead.
We're clear. We have a vision that is not shared by either of the two main political parties, and it's a vision which they have supported largely, not completely, which they have supported in the past, the APNU AFC government up to 2015. And that vision is to solve the ethnic division in Guyana. We can't solve the racial problem, the ethnic problems that exist in the society. What is happening is that those ethnic problems have drifted into our politics, and they control our politics.
Are there structural changes that you're proposing to address the ethnic issue, or are you just saying we just need to hold hand and dance?
No. We are proposing structural changes in the system of governance that will solve the problem, the major problem that is created by the ethnic division in our society. The major problem that it has created is a problem of governance, of the instability and the insecurity in our governance system. And the way to solve that is to ensure that we have a system in which both parties share equally. Africans don't want Indians to be dominant in Guyana in the government, and vice versa. So whatever votes, the votes are close enough for them to come in on the basis of equality, sharing the executive on the basis of equality.
How do you propose to make this happen with 2 to 3, 4, 5 seats in Parliament? After the next election, if you have two very stubborn major political parties who may not be even interested in something like this?
Well, if they're not interested, we go back to election and see what the electorate says, because we can then bring down the government. If we have if neither political party gets a plurality, we have the controlling power, and we can trigger an election. So if you don't agree with us, then we bring down the government and go back to the elections and see what the electorate thinks.
And Mr. Schuman, what's your thought on that? How do you distinguish yourself from the PPP and the PNC, and why should voters consider you if you're going to be if you're not going to be saying the same thing as the PPP and the PNC?
Look, the Liberty and Justice Party, for the first time in the history of Guyana, is represented by youth. There is nothing that is old about us, and I don't mean this. I don't mean any offense to Ralph, but we don't have old ideologies. Our ideas are new. When you look at the ideas, they're very, very progressive, and I think it is for the first time, by electing the Liberty and Justice Party, that you are going to find what I'd say equal development regardless of ethnic identity. We look at inclusive development, and I would also place within there squarely that it is the first time that you will see the marginalized population have anything done for them. You've got people in hinterland communities, you've got people on the coast who have continuously been neglected, regardless of which political party in there. And it is only by the Liberty and Justice Party's election that you are going to be able to make that kind of difference, because we understand what it is to have lived in absolute squalor, to have lived in abject poverty. We are very, very aware of that, and we know what it is to bring people out of that situation. I cannot say that same kind of life has been resident in any other political party.
Mhm. And again, we were hearing about sophisticated issues of constitutional change and bringing the ethnic groups together and so on. But I'm not hearing the bread and butter issues that your average voters may be interested in. I think your voters could care less about. I mean, your average
Salim, but
voters could care
I
less
said
about
that in
constitution change, and they're more interested in a job and education and safety and road that they can drive on without getting killed. Um,
I said that
I'm not
in
hearing. I'm not
one of
hearing
the
the small
statements that you
parties.
talked about. When you asked the question about 45 minutes ago, I said yes, it is nice to talk about constitutional reform and governance, but that has to be married with the day-to-day issues of people. I think that statement, if you go back to the recording, you're going to see that that statement was clearly made. It cannot only be about governance. I know governance in itself covers a wide variety of things and obviously has to deal with the day-to-day issues of people. But you have to look at all of the practical and day-to-day issues of people, the sense of security, the very same things you talk about, employment, education, healthcare. It is nice to talk about how we're going to get into parliament and force the government to change the governance structure and all these things. But there are also a lot of fundamental developmental issues that are being neglected while other
But
conversations, other
but I but I
wider conversations are going on.
but I feel that's where the smaller parties are losing the argument because they're talking about the big, sophisticated issues. And as the opposition leader mentioned in one of his press conferences, that you guys only want constitutional change to create a space for yourself. So that might be the case or might not be the case. But at the end of the day, smaller parties are missing the boat because they're not talking the bread and butter issues. Mr. Ralph Ramkaran, with all due respect, comes from a rich history of political involvement, but yet you talk constantly about this very amorphous issue of governance, which to the average man, he just want to get to work and get a proper pay and not be treated bad at his job. So
Salim,
is there a disconnect with third parties and smaller parties with voters?
Salim, let me bring this back to you again, right? The reason why the Liberty and Justice Party was formed was a transformation of things, not only in governance and how we get the day-to-day issues dealt with. When we talk about the legalization of cannabis, for example, we are not only talking about it because of the respect for the rights of the Rastafarian community. We are talking about it in changing the economic dynamics of people on the ground, about how do we develop a micro and a macro economy around things that change people's lives every day. That means that we don't have to send our young people to prison just for one joint anymore. Look at what we are going to do to the economy. We're destroying families because of a singular, minuscule issue that we have not been willing to enact. Those are bread and butter issues if you're talking about it. By sending one person to prison, what we've done is destroyed not only one life, we've destroyed multiple lives.
Absolutely.
Right? So by addressing some of these core and fundamental issues, you are going to find that a lot of other things get addressed. If you're talking about high crime rates and all these things, crime is driven by poverty, it is driven by need, it is driven by unemployment, right? All of these things. Now, when we start to address the employment issue, we elevate people out of poverty. When we do that, then you are going to see a decrease in the crime rate. And obviously, it is going to have a cascading effect on how we're going to transform the country. And those are some of the fundamental things that we have to start our conversation about. Yes,
Yep.
and I would go back to this. It is nice to talk about constitutional reform. It is nice to talk about third parties. It is nice to talk about all of these fantastic things that maybe could be viewed in a global context. But the Liberty and Justice Party was formed out of the need to address the needs of the people on the ground. We have 68.8% of our population that are young people that feel like they don't have a place in society. We have not created employment for them. We have not created an inclusive society for them. We have 18% of young people who are mixed. We have not found a way to integrate them into the various homes within which they themselves are from. Those are core issues.
Absolutely.
It doesn't matter how much constitutional reform you are going to drive. you cannot address those issues. They're not built in silos. So
And
we obviously have to get down to the education.
yeah,
If you look at it, hate crimes and all these things, most of those things are driven from ignorance. For us, we have to look at an inclusive approach to education so that when you talk about education, education elevates more than just your mind. It elevates people out of poverty. And poverty comes in many, many forms. Poverty
absolutely.
is not only in your pocket.
And again, I don't think
Hold
small
on.
parties in
There's
Guyana's history
there's
has.
intellectual poverty, there's economic poverty, there's social poverty, there's emotional poverty. All of these things are encompassed in poverty.
And
So
this comes
the
back to
only
my
way to get
next.
out of that is education.
This comes back to my next question. And all the smaller parties, and there are new ones, and there's one launching tomorrow, and there's going to be more coming up. So there's probably a host of small parties that are looking to vie for votes in the next election. And it is probably a symptom of a bigger problem, that the two larger parties, the PVP and the PNC, maybe there's an issue why guys like yourself cannot be in them and elevate their discussion and articulate issues that citizens are looking for solutions for. Mr. Ramkaran, you were once an executive of the PPP. Tell us, with the growth of smaller parties, is something wrong with our big parties fundamentally in how they're managing their affairs so as not to allow new ideas and issues to take root and blossom?
Well,
And because of that, people go off and create their own parties.
let me go back to this issue of not talking about matters that directly concern the ordinary person. In order to get 5% growth in the economy, to do something, to have some funds to spend, you need to have an investment of about 25% of the value of the GDP. This government last year had an investment of 5%. Our education system spends $300 per child per year. Barbados, they spend $800 per child per year. The health system is basically the same. So it is not a problem of not doing things right that causes these social problems. It's a problem of not having enough funds. And the reason why we don't have enough funds is that our political instability drives away investment from Guyana. Now, Guyana has no capacity to develop services for the oil industry. Trinidadians and other foreigners are coming here to do that work for us. Mm-hmm. So we were thinking, ANOG is thinking of going into a community in the interior to do some campaigning. And we were told, look, this is a marginalized community, and it has been marginalized for 40 years, 50 years, 60 years. So what do you go and tell the people? Because the two parties have been telling them all the time, you'll get this road, you'll get this school, you'll get this hospital, and so on. You'll get more jobs, you'll get forestry concessions, but nothing happened. So that is not the basic solution. The solution is not finding ways to solve the social problem. The solution is first to deal with the core issue. And the core issue is our system of governance.
And that might be, and I totally agree with you, and that might be absolutely true. But when it comes to election politics, to get to that point, you need votes. And how are you going to get vote if your issues are aloof from the day-to-day realities of people?
Issues are not aloof. We're talking about our vision, our main vision. We have a manifesto which is in preparation, which will be put out in due course, like those of other political parties, where we deal in detail on all of these things, the mining industry, the oil industry, all of these things, education, health, all of these things are already written up. So we have a plan and a program which will be on the internet, which will be online, which will print and deliver to people. So let them know in each community what we plan to do. We also have that as our appeal. But unless we get the governance issue solved, none of these things will happen, because the petroleum wealth that will come into Guyana will go into the hands of a few pockets. That is what will happen. So what is the point of making promises on social issues and you can't solve them because the governance issue allows corruption to continue?
Yeah. And if you can get back to my question that I asked originally, what's fundamentally wrong with the PPP and the PNC that's not allowing the likes of Ram Karan and the likes of Schuman and the likes of Ruel Johnson and the likes of so many others? In fact, Ruel Johnson is launching his party tomorrow, and he's part of the current administration. Why can't he even have a voice within his own administration? So is there fundamentally something that even the parties need to fix so that their own members can be able to articulate issues?
These parties are big parties that demand obedience and demand that you toe the line. That's our politics. That's how our politics operate. I didn't toe the line. We talk about corruption, talk and nothing is happening. I eventually wrote about it and then was abused and chased out. So unless you toe the line, suppress your views, you can't survive in these parties. And that is why you have the AFC, that is why you have ANO, that is why you have LJP, and that is why you have Ruel Johnson is coming out now, because these parties do not accommodate independent voices.
And hence so many political parties. What are your thoughts, Schuman? Why couldn't you?
Let me touch on something that Ralph brought up. Right, when they wanted to go and campaign in a hinterland community, and the people said that it's a marginalized community. He's quite right. As I said, the Liberty and Justice Party was formed because of the neglect of people. I agree that it is good to have a vision. But also, that vision is, I'm sure that the vision is an end goal, but what do you do in between from when we start, from inception, to getting to that vision? The Liberty and Justice Party offers a roadmap about fundamental things and down-to-the-earth things that we fully intend on achieving. Now, if at the end of the day, our ideas are taken on by any single party, and they are implemented, we have no issues with that. If at the end of the day, ANOG is successful in what they want to do and it encompasses part of our vision, then I would see that as our goal achieved. If the PPP or the APNU or AFC or any one of them wants to take our vision and run with it, what we don't want is for those visions to just be used as a campaign promise, and then when the vote is won, they go back to their houses and nothing gets done. The Liberty and Justice Party, we're a party of action, we're a party of principles and action. So that when we talk about something, we don't care who implements it, just as long as it gets implemented, then it is going to be to the benefit of the people. There is nothing wrong with that. I think if we're looking at an altruistic approach to things, bring the ideas out and let the ideas get hold in that sense. Let the parties take it.
Yeah, and again, coming back to the whole premise of this discussion is how do we get you guys into Parliament with as many seats as possible? And to do that, it's not how much ideas you have, but it's how much votes you've got, right? Yep. And that brings me to another question in terms of your smaller parties, especially the two of you, the depth of your party. So far, we have seen very, very little of anyone else besides Mr. Schuman, representing the LJP, and Mr. Ramkaran. We've seen, a few members of yours, Kian and Jonas and so on. But again, we don't see much depth in terms of what you bring to argue your case or to barter with voters.
Well, we're opening our office in Linden on Sunday, and we're going to post the opening online so that we have a big event there. So you will be able to look at us and our speakers and Akani Blair and Henry Jeffrey and so on, who will be speaking at this event. I will be speaking at the event. So we've gone all over the country as far as we can. We go to markets, we go to places where people are, We try to meet people. We have an executive of 11 persons. We had a members meeting 2 Sundays ago, which democratically elected me as their presidential candidate. There were 4 nominations. I was not the only one. There were 4 nominations, and I was the one who was chosen, who was selected. So so we have depth. We're a small party, of course. We have depth. We are on the campaign trail, and it will get hotter and hotter as the time draws nearer.
Great. Mr. Schuman, your depth?
For us, the people that you want to see, they're not easily accessible. I'm going to be blatantly honest with you. We've got people in Georgetown. We've got about 15 people in Georgetown that we continuously dialogue in terms of how we go about doing things. But our membership and our executive are strewn across the country. And it does make it a bit more difficult for us to, what I'd say, to sit down at one table continuously and consistently. But I would assure you that when the time comes to put together that slate of candidates, there is no shortage for us.
Yeah, and I'm quite sure every party can do that. But in terms of at the leadership level and able to present the vision that you talk about, again, I think over the last year we've seen very, very little except for yourself.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that.
Okay, great. So a few more questions because we have about 10 minutes more to go. Guyana, as you know, its election history has been very checkered. It's from crooked to rigged to rigged and so on. What do you feel your role is as smaller parties to ensure free and fair election, to ensure that GCOM sticks to its mandate and to execute on an election that is credible? Of course, the PPP has been championing this as the opposition, but what can you guys do to support that process?
What we intend on doing, and we have done this also, is to reach out to the Carter Center to ask if they can monitor. Of course, they can only come here at the invitation of the government, and we have continuously had dialogue with them in trying to put forward some monitors to ensure that the elections, what I'd say, are transparent in that sense. Mm-hmm. On the ground, we intend on having people at the various polling stations. I don't know that we could field 2,500 polling stations, but we will field as many as we possibly can to ensure that things are done above board in that sense.
Mm-hmm. No, but in terms of now, what kind of muscle can you flex to ensure that GCOM does, maintain its credibility? Not that I'm saying it is not credible, but
we're small parties. We don't have the people. But what we do is we lobby people. We lobby the Carter Center. We lobby the United Nations. We're meeting a delegation from the European Union next week who are interested in observing the elections. We're writing to the GCOM to meet them. We wrote them before LJP met them. I understand that LJP met them. We had written the previous chairman, Mr. Justice Patterson, who refused to meet us. And we're going to make another attempt and make our voices heard in relation to what we believe is required to be done to have a free and fair election. So basically, that's all we can do. Engage as much as possible with the players, with the people who are giving aid and comfort to the Elections Commission, and with the Elections Commission itself. At election time, we will put as many polling agents as we can muster to monitor the election. So we will do our part as much as we can.
Excellent. And I think up until today, there's been headlines about 20,000 being removed. Is the day-to-day working of GCOM on your agenda as smaller parties?
It has always been on our agenda, and this is one of the reasons why we said that GCOM needs to be depoliticized. It needs to be an institution where everyone could look at with absolute integrity. You have to realize that GCOM's role in our country is to safeguard a democracy by ensuring the process is free, fair, and transparent. And a democracy is only as strong as its institutions. If GCOM continues to operate, what I'd say in, I don't want to use the word less than above par, but I could use a lot of other colorful words in that sense. But we have to ensure that integrity is restored to GCOM. The only way to do that is to depoliticize the institution.
Yeah, and we've just received news that, or updates that Chief of Staff of the Guyana Defence Force, retired Brigadier Mark Phillips, has been identified as the prime ministerial candidate for the PPP. Of course, we wish them all the best. Mr. Schuman, you are not presidential candidate of your party. When will we see a presidential candidate from your party, and who would that prime ministerial candidate be?
I think the party elected me as the presidential candidate, so I'd have to correct you on that.
Okay. I thought you were just the leader.
I have always been, well, since our very first meeting, I was elected the presidential candidate. In terms of the prime ministerial candidate, we are still in the process of going through that, but I want to say congratulations to Brigadier Phillips on his election, and I can only say I wish you well and hope that you could do what needs to be done for the country, and not just for a political party.
Mr. Ramkaran, what kind of presidential prime ministerial candidate can we expect from Anug?
Well, we don't have a prime ministerial candidate, and we don't have we're not required to present a prime ministerial candidate. The PNC didn't for many for decades. We are still searching for somebody who we can present, a candidate who we can present to the electorate. If we get one before the election, we will certainly.
Yeah. Has the prime ministerial position be some kind of other race kind of issue? Because the PPP, of course, chose an Afro-Guyanese, and it's been like that for many years. And the PNC, I'm quite sure, is shopping around for an Indian to be their prime ministerial candidate. Is this part of the problem also?
No. Parties usually like to show a mixed leadership when they go to the electorate because it's a mixed society.
Yeah,
that's normal.
Yeah. But what I'm saying though, that it's the ethnic positions are already fixed almost. Presidential candidates for the PP goes to Indian, prime ministerial goes to African, and vice versa for the PNC.
Salam, here's the thing, right? I've said this many times, is that no party, you would never find an Afro-Guyanese as the presidential candidate for the PPP, nor an Indo-Guyanese as presidential candidate for the PNC. And you are quite correct. It seems as though those positions are quite taken by the other ethnicities. They tend to want to play 1 and 2 in that sense. That obviously leaves a lot of people like myself and another significant component of the population out of the picture. And even anyone looking at us with any serious eye of leadership. And the Liberty and Justice Party is a party that opens the doors for every single person to aspire to be the president of the country.
Yeah. Great. So we've got a few more minutes. I want to get your thoughts on...
That is what our system proposes. Under a system of equality, the the cabinet will be the chief executive, and the president will be nominated annually from among members of the cabinet.
Sorry, Salam.
That's good.
So the president will be nominated annually, one every year for 5 years, from among members of the government. Hi, dear. Hello.
Say hello.
And, so that you will have the opportunity of having Indian, African, Amerindian, mixed, woman, youth. So you have all kinds of, the whole spectrum of the Guyanese population will have the opportunity to serve as the president of Guyana during the course of the life of a government.
Yeah, great.
Alan, before you go.
Mm-hmm.
Under
Yeah,
the
I'm not going anywhere. Actually, I was going to
it
my
almost
final
sounded
question.
like you're wrapping up there.
No, no, no. Just
I was going
go
to say,
ahead.
I quite support what Ralph is doing, but under the Liberty and Justice Party, I think it will be the very first time that you're going to see an indigenous person as the president of Guyana, and we look forward to that very much.
Awesome.
By opening that door, you have to realize that traditionally you would have always had Indo and Afro who are juggling for the top tier of society. Indigenous peoples have always been looked at as third-class citizens by us, and when Lennox Schumann becomes the president, we open that door for every single person to aspire to be the leader of the country.
Well, that's providing you don't do what everyone is thinking that you want to do, is join the APNU, and you remain that leader. But come back to my final questions, and it relates to this. If election was held tomorrow, and you can include this in your closing statement, if election was held tomorrow, is to be held tomorrow, how do you gauge your support, and how much success do you believe you will get after tomorrow's election?
There was a poll that was conducted. I think it has not been declared yet, but I think the PPP is enjoying 44% of support in this point. And once again, this is not consistent numbers, and it doesn't add up to 100, but just how the answers came in, right? The APNU AFC coalition was around 34, and LJP was around 16%. So I think for us, 16% for a party that was only established in pretty much in January, 16% is better than the AFC did up until their last election. So we're okay with that.
So you say you're good with 16%. Mr. Ramkaran, tomorrow's election, how are you coming out?
I don't know where we are on the polls, but I'm hoping that we will do very well, and we will get, if we don't win the elections, we will get sufficient votes to have a balance of power in the National Assembly. That's where I hope that we will be.
Great.
Whatever that takes.
Yeah, and in your final statement, I want to ask both of you again, how do you mitigate against the mistrust that the AFC has placed on, the burden it has placed on third parties?
Well, I want to say that I came out of political retirement to deal with a situation which the main parties do not deal with. And I didn't come out of political retirement on my own. I didn't launch a party on my own as the leader. A group of people came together to find out what was the problem in Guyana, if there was a problem, if there was, what was the problem, and if that problem and how that problem can be solved. And we identified the problem as a governance problem, and the only way it can be solved was by getting into the political arena, because seminars, lectures, and all these kind of things are not working. And that is why I'm here, not by myself, but with a group of people. So we hope, therefore, to present this agenda to the people of Guyana and hope they will support it. And let me mention something about age, because it hasn't come up in your in our discourses. Jagan and Barnum were young men who started in 1950.
You've got 30 seconds.
10 seconds. Were the political problems solved by them in their youth, or did they get worse? These were young people. So I don't know what this fetish is about young people. What did Barajagdev solve the political instability that exists in Guyana? He was a young man. But what we have in the United States, neither the president of the US nor none of the Democratic contenders are below the age of 70. None of them. So this fetish about youth only exists in Guyana. It doesn't exist anywhere else. And the youth have not served us well.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Ramkaran.
So now I would have to disagree with Mr. Ramkaran on the youth has not served us well, because the youth were coming out of entrenched position that had been established by those political parties. The parties would have laid the groundwork for them in how they, for pretty much for their MO. What the Liberty and Justice Party is doing is a new party with new leadership, and we're talking about youth and incorporating young voices into decision making. Those are some of the fundamental things. The reason why the country is in this position is because we have not created that space for the young voices to be heard. The solutions of tomorrow cannot be solved by the ideas of yesterday.
Okay.
It has to be solved by ideas that are forward-looking and
Great.
futuristic in that sense. But what we intend on doing, how do we work around this mistrust? It is a very difficult question. But once again, we were formed to address the marginalized population, the people who continue to live below the poverty line, and to ensure that not only do they get their fair say, but that they get their fair share of the nation's pie. And we fully intend and we are committed to ensuring that development and justice touches every single Guyanese equally.
Well, that I want to say thank you very much, Mr. Ramkaran and Mr. Schumann, for your time.
Team youth leaders, not youth generally.
We thank you for your time. Yeah, we thank you for your time. We thank you for your efforts and for bringing some of the key issues that Guyana is looking at as part of your platform as smaller parties. We wish you all best in the upcoming election, and you're always welcome on these platforms to discuss issues that affect Guyana. With that, I want to say a special good night to everyone for staying up and learning about these two political parties and how they address the issue of mistrust among third parties. I know, Devin, we had a poll. I'll ask Devin to release the results of that poll. But just before that, I just want to make sure that the statement that I made about the prime ministerial candidate for the PPP is accurate. I'm not 100% sure it is accurate. It was brought to my attention. But please stay tuned to Globespan 24x7 for updates on that specific matter. Devin, what's the result of the poll? And again, the poll was whether you will give new parties an opportunity in the 2020 elections.
Yes, at least 36% has responded yes, that they will, and 64% has responded no. Thank you.
Thank you, Devin. And with that, I want to say there is hope for the third parties. 36% is not that bad. And in fact, it's awesome and it's excellent. And you could take that to the bank, so to speak. Well, good night, and God bless you and your family, and have a great rest of the week and your weekend.
Thank you so much, Salim. Good night, Ralph.
Thank you. Good night.